The Games Workshop Heavy Metal team paints incredible box art. Crisp edge highlighting, buttery smooth blends, and enough hours invested, most of us are never going to paint our armies that way and can never achieve that result. But here's the thing, I don't actually think smoothness is what makes a miniature look like a display piece. I think it's contrast, color variation, brushstrokes with intention, and texture. The kind of things that your eyes are going to notice long before it notices a perfect blend. So today I'm painting the new Big Boss from the Armageddon box set using almost nothing but transparent glazes and deliberate brushwork to answer two questions. Can simple techniques create a model that doesn't just compete with the box art, but actually becomes more interesting to look at? And can I do that in under 5 hours? What's up everyone, and welcome back to Grimdark Minis. One of the biggest misconceptions in our hobby is that display quality comes from making every transition as smooth as possible and painting every detail to a 10 out of 10. And while that absolutely has its place and does yield amazing results, I think we've forgotten that paint itself has character. Traditional paintings don't hide every brushstroke they use to create energy, texture, and life. So instead of fighting the paint, we're going to let it do some of the work for us. By building up quick translucent glazes and leaving intentional texture behind, we're going to see just how far a few simple techniques can take this orc. Now for the painting. We're going to be kicking things off with our orc skin, as any good orc player will do. And to do that, we're going to be using only 3 paints. Orc flesh, which from here on in the video is just going to be called orc flesh for simplicity, Caliban green for shadows, and screaming skull for our highlights. The very first color that we're going to be starting with is going to be orc flesh to establish our base. Now this might actually be the most time-consuming part of the entire model. I am thinning the paint way down in order to get a flat, uniform base coat, which did mean it took about 5 thin coats before I had a solid base to work off of. It's definitely not the most exciting step, but this foundation is what's going to make every glaze we add later behave predictably in the way we want it to. With that established, we can start building depth instead of covering up previous mistakes and streakiness. For the shadows, I'm mixing in Caliban green with the original orc flesh. Rather than treating this like a layer paint, we're going to be using it as a glaze. A glaze is simply paint that's been thinned down enough to become transparent. Instead of covering up what's underneath, each pass gently shifts the color just a little bit at a time. That's what gives you those rich and natural transitions, without having to perfectly blend every edge fully. And by fully covering our skin in green in the previous step, we are going to end up with super vibrant shadows that add contrast and visual interest to the model, rather than just having black holes everywhere on our model. The brushwork is going to be just as important as our paint consistency. For the paint consistency, I like to add about 4 parts water to 1 part paint, though it just kind of depends on the paint and feeling it out on your wet palette. Which for this, and doing glazes, I would never try without a wet palette, so check one of my previous videos where I go into detail about that. Also, there's a million of them on YouTube, I'm sure you can find one. For the actual brush work, I always load up my brush and wick off the excess, just letting it touch the tip of the paper towel just to get a little bit of that extra moisture out of there. Then I pull the stroke away from the brightest area and towards the shadows when shading down. As the brush runs through the paint, it naturally is going to leave more pigment at the end of the stroke, so every pass is going to reinforce the recesses while keeping our raised muscles clean and bright. Don't try to force the contrast in one pass. Think of it like slowly developing a photograph. Each glaze doesn't look like much on its own, but after a few passes, the shadows become richer, the volumes become clearer, and the miniatures start to paint itself. And if you make mistakes here, remember that painting is an additive process. We can always go back with our orc flesh, and in fact, that's the next step. But you'll also notice I'm not trying to eliminate every brush stroke. Those subtle variations in color and texture are exactly what we're after. Skin isn't a perfectly flat substance, so it's going to have a little bit of ridges, raised edges, scratches, marks, you name it. So texture is going to create visual interest that perfectly smooth blends often lose, especially once you step back and look at the model as a whole. Once I'm happy with where my shadows are at, it's time to bring the light back. Instead of reaching for a brighter color immediately, I'm going right back to our original orc flesh for a few passes of glazes. This is something I think a lot of painters skip, but it creates a much smoother transition because we're reconnecting the shadows to our midtone before we introduce our highlight color. Just like before, I'm thinning this into a glaze, but now the direction of our brush stroke is going to flip. I start each stroke down, starting in the darker area, and then pull it towards the top of the muscles where the light would naturally catch. As I had said before, as the brush loses paint, it deposits more pigment towards the end of your stroke as you lift the brush. We are going to gradually do this to rebuild our bright areas while leaving our shadows that we've already established almost completely untouched and just gently blended in. This is one of the biggest advantages of glazing. You're not painting individual highlights, you're slowly shifting the hue and balance of light across the surface. Every pass is going to nudge the form just a little bit closer to where you want them, giving you complete control without any harsh transition lines. After a few passes, the muscles really start to round out, and now we have a solid foundation for our brightest highlights. For those, I'm going to be mixing in Screaming Skull. I'm using exactly the same glazing technique, but this time I'm being a little bit more selective. The paint is only going to go onto the highest points of each muscle, towards the tops of the biceps, peaks of the forearms, the brows, the knuckles, anywhere that could catch the strongest light. And I like to imagine that this is where also like a little bit of sweat is glistening off in a bright of light, and that's what's creating this shine. That's what I try to go for these. Notice that I'm not trying to cover the entire raised area. Each glazing pass that I do is smaller than the last, concentrating the brightest color into a tighter space. That's what's going to create the illusion of volume. The transitions stay soft because they're built over multiple transparent passes, but the contrast keeps increasing where it matters the most. At this point, our skin has depth, saturation, texture, all created with just a handful of colors and very careful brush placement. No complicated blending, just letting transparent layers do all of the heavy lifting for us. With the skin finished, I want to break up all that green by introducing a little bit of color variation around the face. One of the easiest ways to make flesh feel more believable is to remember that not every part of it is going to be the same color. For the lips and inside of the mouth, I'm starting with a base coat of dark plum. It's a rich, desaturated purple that immediately separates those areas from the surrounding skin without looking overly vibrant. From there, I'm not switching completely colors. Instead, I began introducing Screaming Skull into the dark plum just a little bit at a time, creating progressively lighter mixes, and wanting to keep this in the same general highlight tone as our main skin. The key here is that I'm working with while the previous layer is still slightly damp. It's going to be kind of like a light wet blend. Each lighter mix is placed just a little bit higher on the lips and raised details, then feathered back into the dark areas with the tip of the brush. Because both layers are still workable, they naturally soften into one another, giving me a smooth transition without having to chase a perfect blend. Every mix gets a little bit brighter and covers a little less area. That gradual reduction is what creates the illusion of form, making the lips feel round instead of flat. It's a subtle detail, but these small shifts in color are what keep the face interesting. We've already used value to define muscles, and now we're using hue to separate different types of flesh. Those little decisions add up and make the final model feel much more lifelike. One of those small details that makes a surprisingly big difference: the teeth. Just like everything else, I don't want these looking perfectly clean. Real teeth have texture, discoloration, and years of wear, so I want this to be very uneven. I'm starting with a base coat of Thondia brown, rather than jumping straight into an ivory color. From there, I begin mixing Screaming Skull into the brown a little bit at a time, creating progressively lighter tones. Instead of painting on broad highlights, I'm applying each mix as thin, deliberate lines, the length of each tooth. Now with our skin finished, I want to knock out a few of the smaller details before moving on to the other larger focal points. These aren't the areas that are going to steal the show, so there's no sense in overcomplicating them. First up is the shirt. I'm keeping the palette nice and muted by using Rakarth Flesh as my base and a neutral gray to establish the shadows. Simple combination, but it gives us a worn, dirty fabric that feels right at home on an orc without competing for any attention. Just like we've been doing throughout the skin, I'm relying on thin, controlled layers rather than trying to force the result in one coat. A few quick glazing passes of neutral gray into the folds are enough to create depth while leaving plenty of that Rakarth Flesh visible on the raised areas. The goal here isn't to make the shirt a centerpiece, it's to support everything around it by keeping the values compressed and the colors desaturated. The fabric naturally is going to sit in the background, letting the skin and armor remain the stars of the model while still looking fully rendered and painted. Now we get to see what makes this model feel like an orc. The armor, the weapons, the belts, the pouches, and just about every other piece of random equipment that hangs off them. The story I wanted this model to tell is that none of this gear is fresh from the orky mechanical factories. These orcs have been fighting, scavenging, and digging, picking whatever they can out of the mud as they push across Armageddon, beating back those poor, defenseless, weak Imperials. Their equipment should feel old, abused, and held together through basically sheer stubbornness. To tie all those materials together, I'm starting with a base coat of Thondia brown over everything that's eventually going to become leather or rusted metal. The leather straps are the one exception. Since they'll stay brown in the finished pieces, I want a nice solid foundation for that. That means a couple more saturated passes to build up full opacity and give me a rich, even color to work from later. For everything that's eventually going to be metal though, I'm not worried if the coverage is a little patchy. This isn't the finished color, it's just an underpainting. In fact, the slight inconsistencies actually work in our favor because they'll create subtle variation once the metallics start going over the top. This is another place where thinking ahead saves time. Instead of painting clean silver first and then trying to weather it afterwards, we're building the rust and texture into the model from the very beginning. Every metallic layer that follows will inherit a little of that warmth underneath, making the armor and weapons feel aged naturally instead of looking like a shiny metal with rust painted on afterwards. With the underpainting finished, it's now time to start creating some texture. For this step, I'm reaching for my oldest and most used brushes. A small piece of sponge works just as well, but I actually prefer a beat-up brush just because it gives a little bit more control while still creating the nice random marks that we're looking for. I'm loading it up with Doombull Brown, then wiping most of the paint back off and gently stippling it over the surface. The important thing here is that I'm not trying to make it even. In fact, the more irregular these marks are, the more convincing they'll look. Rust doesn't grow in perfect gradients or need circles, it develops wherever moisture sits, paint chips away, and bare metal is exposed. So I'm concentrating this texture around rivets, into recesses, along sharp corners, inside deep scratches, and anywhere else the armor looks like it's taken a beating. Rather than just painting rust, think of this as building a history of the model. Every little speck and broken edge suggests years of wear, impacts, and exposure to the elements. Doombull Brown is down, we're going to build on that texture rather than cover it up. This time I'm switching over to Xandri Dust and I'm going to use the exact same stippling technique, but with a little bit more restraint. Instead of covering large areas, I'm concentrating these marks right in the middle of the Doombull Brown layer. Think of this like creating layers of corrosion. The Doombull Brown established that warm, oxidized foundation, while the Xandri Dust introduced a lighter, chalkier texture that gives the rust much more depth. Less is definitely more here. I'm using fewer marks, covering a smaller area, and letting plenty of that dark brown remain visible around the edges. With all of our underpainting finished, it is finally time to bring the metal to life. I'm going to be doing that with an overbrush of my metallic paint. If you've never heard the term before, think of it as a middle ground between a regular layer and a dry brush. Unlike dry brushing where you're wiping almost all the paint off, an overbrush leaves just a little bit more paint in the bristles. The brush is still fairly dry, but it has enough paint to lightly cover broad and flat surfaces instead of only catching the sharpest edges. That makes it perfect for weathered metal. As I work across the armor, the metallic naturally catches the raised details and larger flat areas, while all of the brown and tan texture we spent time building stays tucked away in the recesses and pokes out around damaged sections. The result is metal that already looks aged before we've added a single rust wash or weathering effect. Instead of painting rust on top of silver, we're painting the history first and then let the metal emerge through it. One thing to keep in mind that isn't meant to completely cover the underpainting. If you find yourself burying all the texture, you've probably got too much paint on the brush. Let those warm browns and tans peek through. They're doing a lot of the heavy lifting in this and making this armor feel old, neglected, and perfectly orky, while also saving you a lot of time on the back end. Checkerboards. What everybody has been waiting for the entire time that they've been watching an orc painting video. The bane of every orc painter's existence. And yet somehow still one of the coolest details that you can put on a model and one of the most satisfying. Now in my head I like to imagine some overly confident orc sat there painting these on by hand before the next big fight. So if they're a little crooked, a little uneven, it's just lore accurate, really. But in reality, I just don't have an hour to spend painting a single shoulder pad. So jokes aside, the biggest mistake I see people make is trying to paint every square perfectly from the start. It's not going to happen. Instead, I'm using a heavily thin gray over the black and sketching in a few rough guidelines here first. Nothing fancy, just something to establish the spacing and direction of the pattern and get me going. Once those guidelines are in place, I like to start blocking in the alternating squares. At this stage, I'm really not worried if they look a little weird. They're going to, because this isn't the finished product. Realistically, it's just a sketch. From there, it's about refinement. I'm going to be bouncing back and forth a bunch of times between gray and black, tightening one edge, correcting another, squaring off a corner, then fixing the square next to it because I messed that up at the same time. Every pass gets the pattern just a little bit cleaner until you finally get to a result that you're happy with. Think of this kind of like sculpting rather than drawing. You're not expecting to nail every square on the first attempt. You're slowly carving the pattern into place using paint. Honestly, don't chase perfection on this. Slight inconsistencies actually make checkerboards feel hand-painted, which fit orcs way better than perfectly measured, machined straight lines ever could. My other big point that I want to get across here is don't get so attached to the time you've already invested that you're afraid to reset something. Mistakes are going to happen here, and that's completely normal. About 10 minutes into painting these checks, I realized the entire bottom row just wasn't working. The spacing was off, squares were getting stretched out, and I could have kept trying to force it, but instead I just painted over it and started that row again. Honestly, it made me way happier to do it that way. It's probably the biggest tip I can give you. Sometimes spending 2 minutes repainting an area will give you a way better result at the end than spending 20 minutes trying to rescue it and futz and not get it right. Checkerboards are all about iteration. Paint a few squares, clean them up, adjust the spacing, paint over a mistake, refine it again, and every pass will get you a little bit closer to the final result. Checks laid out, we can finally make it a little bit less flat with a few quick edge highlights. I'm going back to administrative with gray, but instead of tracing every edge with a crisp line, I'm going to use a small broken stipple mark focused towards the upper corner of each gray square. This does a couple things. First, it reinforces the direction of our light, making each individual square feel like it has a little bit of volume. But more importantly, those broken marks stop the checkerboard from looking too clean and perfect. It feels like worn paint that's been chipped, scuffed, and faded over years of fighting. Our checkerboard handled fully, I want to go ahead and move on to the rest of the black armor. Black is one of those colors that seems simple, but can actually be one of the trickiest to make interesting. The mistake a lot of people make is highlighting black with straight gray. While that works, it can quickly start looking like gray armor instead of black armor. Instead, I like to introduce a little bit of color into my highlights. For this, I start with a blue-black as my first highlight. It's one of my favorite colors by Pro Acryl. I use it nearly on every model. The cool tones keep the armor feeling dark while giving the black some depth and separation from the other colors on the model. For the massive horns on his boss pole, I wanted to do these a little bit different. Traditionally, when you look at horns, you'll often see them getting darker towards the tips. It makes a lot of sense from a realistic perspective, and it's a great way to approach them. But for this model, I wanted to flip that idea and experiment a little bit. After all, we're painting an orc. This isn't about perfectly recreating nature, it's about creating something that feels interesting and fits the character. I'm starting with a mix of Fondia Brown and Screaming Skull, creating a warm, bone-like mid-tone. From there, I'm going to slowly push that color lighter as I move towards the tips of the horns. The transition is built using a combination of thin glazes and textured brush strokes. The glazes help create that gradual shift in color, while the fine lines add the natural ridges and growth patterns you'd expect to see on a horn. When working on details like this, don't think of it as painting a gradient from one color to another. Think of it more like building up layers of age and texture. Each glaze changes the overall tone slightly, while each textured line adds another piece of information for the eye to read. The brighter tips aren't necessarily the most realistic approach, but they help draw attention to the shape and create a stronger focal point on the model. With our basic color transition and texturing in place, I'm going to use one final step to tie everything together. This is actually the first and only acrylic wash style step I'm using on the entire model. I'm taking a little bit of skeleton horde contrast and thinning it down with some water to create a very light glaze. The goal here isn't to create a heavy shade like you normally would with a wash. Instead, I'm using it as a unifying filter that will soften the transitions and bring all of those different tones together. I'm running this along the length of the horns, letting the pigment settle naturally into the texture and the small lines we created earlier. Because it's thinned down, it won't overpower the highlights underneath, it will just add that extra bit of warmth and depth that make the horns feel like a single cohesive surface. I'm close now with just a few final details left to bring everything together. At this stage, I like to start looking at the smaller areas that can add a lot of personality and storytelling. First up, we're going to tackle our red areas. To keep the worn, grimy feel of the model, I'm starting with dark plum as our foundation. This deep muted purple is going to give us a richer shadow than just starting with a straight red and then having black in the recesses. From there, I'll begin working up into corn red using thin layers and controlled glazing to slowly build the color back up. The goal isn't to make these areas bright and clean, instead I want the red to feel deep, aged, and integrated with the rest of the model. This is also where I want to create some separation between the different red elements of the miniature. Even though they share a similar color family, they shouldn't all look identical. I'm going to have a few Blood Angel pieces scattered around the base to fit with the Armageddon theme, so I'm going to switch over to Mephiston red for those. This is a much brighter, cleaner red compared to the worn reds we're using on the Ork equipment. For a red cloth, I want it to feel like a completely different material. By keeping our shadows deeper and controlling where our bright reds appear, we can make it read as fabric instead of painted armor or metal. Now that all of our individual armor pieces and everything else is painted, time to bring everything together and really sell that aged, rusty look. This is where we can take all the texture we built underneath and make it come alive. For this step, I'm making an oil wash using burnt sienna. Unlike a traditional all-over wash, I'm not covering the entire model with it. Instead, I'm using a targeted weathering tool, placing it exactly where I want that rust and grime to stand out. I'm taking the wash and dabbing it into areas where rust would naturally collect. And the reason I like using an oil for this step is the control it gives you. Because it stays workable for longer, I can push the pigment exactly where I want it and then soften areas if something gets a little bit too heavy. It allows me to enhance the story we've already built rather than covering up the work underneath. The important thing here is restraint. We spent all the time creating those layers of Doombull and Xandri underneath the metallics, now we're just bringing those details forward. The goal isn't to make the entire model orange, it's to create little pockets of warmth and corrosion that draw your eye to the model. This is the point where the model starts feeling less like a freshly painted mini and more like a piece of battlefield equipment. And finally, we're going to finish things off with our base. I wanted the environment to match the story of the model. This isn't a clean display plinth, this is a battlefield where an orc has been stomping through the dirt and dragging trophies behind him. To start, I'm blocking in all the major elements. The Blood Angel pieces are getting a base coat of Mephiston, which will immediately stand out as something different from our Ork's own worn and battered equipment. For our rocks, I'm using Rakarth Flesh, keeping these a lighter neutral color to help break up the darker tones of the model. Finally, for the ground itself, I'm going in with Xandri dust. It gives us that dry, dusty battlefield base that fits perfectly with the harsh environment we're trying to create. Once everything is based and in place, I'm going to add one of my favorite quick tricks for creating natural texture. I'm mixing a dark yellow ochre pigment into water and then simply dabbing it across the surface of the base. As our water evaporates, the pigment naturally settles into recesses, cracks, and low points of the terrain, instead of having to manually paint every bit of dust and dirt. The great thing about the technique is that it creates a really organic finish. Some areas will be heavier, some lighter, and the pigment will naturally follow the texture of our base. Here we have it. The Big Boss from the Armageddon box is finally finished. At the start of this video, I had two questions I wanted to answer. First, can we do something that is more visually interesting than the box art? And second, can we complete it under 5 hours? For the first question, I'll let you decide. Let's see what we think. I'll let you decide in the comments section. The Games Workshop box art is always incredible, but I think the biggest takeaway from this model is that display quality doesn't have to come from perfect blends or spending dozens of hours chasing tiny details. Instead, we focused on creating interest through color, texture, and contrast, building the skin with layered glazes, using direction and transparency to create volume, using texture and brushwork to create rusty and battered armor before the metallics even went down. We added color variation, weathering, and small details that help tell the story of the orc and the battlefield he's been fighting through. And for the second question, yes, we did manage to finish this model in under 5 hours. The skin was definitely the biggest time investment, taking around 2.5 hours by itself, but once that foundation was finished, everything else came together much faster by relying on techniques that created a lot of impact without requiring endless steps. The armor was built through simple textured layers, the metals were enhanced by the work we did underneath, and the smaller details were painted with the same philosophy: focus your effort where it matters the most. The biggest takeaway from this model: you don't need to paint every miniature like it's going to competition. You don't need to spend 40 hours chasing perfection. Sometimes the best result comes from understanding how to spend your time and using simple techniques with intent. So what do you think? Did we create something more interesting than the box art? Let me know down below in the comments. And if you enjoyed this style of painting breakdown, consider subscribing to Grimdark Minis for more fast, fun, Grimdark miniature painting tutorials. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.